I totally agree with the views of things you see as being cloaked under the law. To me, and that's building a little bit on what you said on the global connectivity and the inequalities, to me the law, and this has been the obsession of, again, my research and my practice, the law really cloaks a lot of class and capital interests. And there are so many examples looking at, for example, one of the things that like personally breaks my heart is looking at the Iraq war, the invasion of Iraq, and the first laws that were put in place by the newly appointed puppet Iraqi government had to do with, and these were laws, and they had to do with opening up investments to internationals so that Americans can invest. It had to do with privatizing the oil industry so that Americans can make use of it and then other multinationals. And it's just heartbreaking that this is the kind of thing that is cloaked by the law, and at the same time cloaked in the name of freedom and rights and openness and liberalism and so on. And we have so many examples, and you know, we're witnessing Venezuela in the happening right now, and we're going to see the same. I wouldn't be surprised if they copy and paste the laws from Iraq to apply it to Venezuela, to open up the economy and to serve specific capital interests. From Egypt, we had a few months after the revolution, we had a law that was passed, and it was called, in 2011, it was called the Protection of Work. And the Protection of Work law was basically an anti-strike and anti-organizing in workplaces law. And to me, thinking about all the sorts of investment laws, tax laws, property laws, housing laws, all these legal frameworks that, and in a country that respects the rule of law, at least the population has a lot of respect for the rule of law, having all of these laws in place, at the end of the day ends up cloaking a very class-based project. It is an intentional project, I agree with you, but I also see it as class. It's imperialist in many ways, and we see that throughout the globalization of legal systems that have to do with investments and foreign investors in particular, and that is a big source of frustration that in many of the law scholarly circles, this is not taking center stage.
Just to pick up where Heba left off about financial legal regulation, I think in various ways, and I completely agree about how law is used in subversive ways, sometimes to oppress, sometimes to control, sometimes both. But I think there's also huge capacity within that for us to harness and use those same legal frameworks to the benefit of people. I see in the news today that Egypt is increasing its basic minimum wage from, 1,000 something to 2,000. South Africa, for the first time, has a basic minimum wage. These are ways in which, as academics and practitioners, we can also use the law in ways to push a more progressive agenda. When we talk about populism, and of course in the way it's defined politically as an entirely negative thing, but we also forget that advocacy campaigns are built around a kind of populism, and that we can use them to push the agenda in ways that we think need to happen. For example, in South Africa, the current debates on land, the issue is about land dispossession during colonial times and during apartheid, and needing to fix those problems. But the issue itself can be taken in any direction that we choose to take it. At the moment, it's being used entirely politically for electoral purposes to push for votes, really. So any party that says expropriation is a party that people are willing to vote for. Whereas it should be used to push progressive policies to reduce inequality, to redistribute wealth in the country. What it's likely to do, though, is to reinforce inequality and to concentrate ownership on men. rather than any other vulnerable groups. So we're dealing with the same issue. It could go in any direction. Our job is to push it in whichever direction we think is progressive. But it's a difficult job as a lawyer, because the law itself is always in flux. So even in this conversation, we're talking about the law as separate from the issues. So the law is the static thing that we can direct and use and then whatever, but in a sense is fixed, inflexible. But the issues change, the time changes, the context changes. But actually the law itself is constantly in flux. In South Africa, we've had 3 very defined political periods. Within that, many other periods, but for the ease of simplicity, 3 particular political periods during apartheid, the 25 years post-apartheid, and maybe from this moment onwards, or the last few years at least. And during apartheid, law was in a state of disorder, even while it was used itself as a tool of oppression. And then we entered a constitutional democracy, and for about 20 to 25 years lived in what many, I think, perceived as a state of legal stability. We always had the Constitution as a founding document. Law couldn't be arbitrarily made. There were concerted efforts for public participation to include experts in the drafting of legislation. And now we're having a total pushback on even the idea of having a constitution. So it's not easy for lawyers to be at the forefront of these issues. In a way, we are always playing catch up in any given moment, and we just have to be better, I think, at not seeing ourselves as pure academics, but being involved in NGOs or other civil society role players, so that we can actually infuse the academy with a more social legal understanding.
I'm hearing a couple of things come up right now, and it's frustrating me as a moderator of this discussion, because I don't have an answer, and I'm wondering if the 5 of you can help me come up with an answer. I'm hearing some people say, law is a problem. Law invokes power. When the law exists, we see it as even academics who don't wish to invoke power still see the law as something stable, something that we can contribute to, something that we can change. But still it's part of a process of power that, unless we understand, as Smith said, the lived realities of the people who are most vulnerable in the society, then we can never do our jobs successfully, perhaps. But at the same time, I see a kind of animation of all of you towards there's this movement towards, yes, law is part of the problem, but we're still stuck that the solution is also in the law. So law becomes at once the problem that we are trying to solve through the law. So should I take my bar license and burn it outside of the university and say forget it, because law is part of the problem and it's part of the solution, which 20 years from now will be another problem that I myself created through this very solution that I thought should be legal? So I'm wondering if you can help me, through your own context, understand what is then left of the law. What does the law even mean if it is creating the very problems that we wish to solve through the very thing that may create future problems? Or, as one of you said earlier, is there a porousness to the law where, almost like we're holding sand in our hands, and the sand can kind of filter through, and good things can be kept in our hands, but the sand filters maybe the rocks we want to find that are good, and the sand just filters through. How can we understand, use, utilize, make sense of the law, given the dynamics of power that are always embedded in it? It's a big question, but I think I want to lead you there at this point in our discussion.
think one of the ways to approach the problem as intractable as it presents itself is to start the interrogation of who is making the law and for what purpose is the law being made. The global legal regime as we know it is structured around states. The international legal order is structured around states. But we know that non-state actors are on the rise, and they are slowly but surely creating the agenda, setting the agenda, executing the agenda, and also working with the grassroots to create maybe the illusion that that is also the bottom-up desire with regards to where the agenda should go. And so I think, not to hazard a solution, but to say that one of the ways we can begin to use the law properly is to understand who's wielding the law and for what purpose is that law being wielded. And being in Nigeria, and I have the quote-unquote luxury of being pessimistic, because nothing seems to ever work. But understanding that the perpetration of that pessimism isn't going to solve anything. And so it's easy to always say we have good laws on paper, the problem is implementation or the lack of political will. But it's not enough to stop at saying the problem is the lack of political will. What is it about every recurring regime that makes it incapable of having political will? And is it a case of incompetence? Is it a case of ineptitude? Is it a case of ignorance? Or is it simply a case of there is a vested interest in things remaining the same? So I work, for example, in the right to health, and it would seem that health is apolitical in the sense that everybody should get access to good health. But we know that that isn't the case. So even health agenda, what is put as the public policy priority, is a function of international donors, is a function of where states put their funding priorities. And that is also a function of, on one hand, you need healthy citizens to push the machinery of capitalism, but at the same time, you also, at the risk of sounding pessimistic, you also don't want them to be too strong to be able to push you out of power. So you need to understand that even for things that seem apolitical, there is an agenda, and I think the job for us is to conscript that power. And I was at a talk where somebody was talking about the Egyptian revolution and said the real problem with the revolution was that you simply unseated those who were there, and then you were like, there was the illusion that power was apolitical, now we're fine, and power was left vacant, and people just grabbed the power, and realizing that there is power, there is potent power, and it's that power that drives the agenda, it's that power that drives where the law goes for its own ends. And so the question is, whose ends are we serving, even as researchers? Because, I mean, you need to feed, so you need to get grants. But who's giving you the grants? What's the agenda behind the people that are giving you the grants? What research are you prioritizing in your own work? And so even in our own work, it replicates itself. So I don't think that necessarily is an answer, but I think it's an invitation to rethink the way we conceive of the law and who's wielding the law with regards to your question.
Yeah, I just want to agree with Wami. So in terms of who's conceiving the law and what do we define as the law, these are age-old conversations again about how, there's a hierarchy of laws. From law school they teach us, customary law at the bottom, and then, there's this hierarchy. And so for me, the honest conversation I keep having with myself is how am I challenging myself to see the law through the broad sense of reality, of the lived realities of people. So again, in criminal law, we just sort of idolize the criminal justice system for solving crime and for providing redress to victims of sexual violence, which is my work. But we know that doesn't work. But even though we know that doesn't work, we still look at the other alternatives as alternatives. We call them alternative. yesterday there was a fantastic panel on the other law. It is still the other law. And we call it alternative other law, and then there is the real law, which is essentially the Western Anglo-Saxon way of resolving disputes, and then there is the African problematic informal other. And that's just ridiculous that this is still the way that we think about the law. And the honest conversation to have is we can't think about the law like this. If it's not to say informal justice systems are perfect, but if we're going to invest a lot of time and money and research and capacity in making these formal institutions work, the same could be done for informal alternative other. So for me, it's just an attitude question of we still need to unlearn a lot of what we think we know about what the law is and versus what really people's life, because people organize outside of the law all the time and it works for them. So it's catching up to that reality. And then again, about Wami saying the hand that feeds you. Because now the hand that feeds you really does own you, and by owning you, it sets the agenda for you. And now I'm in a space where I can take on consultancies, and these are research projects and grants that will feed into legal reform processes, law reform processes, and policy reform processes. And so what questions are we asking? Who's funding the questions that we're asking? What's important to ask and why? So it's taking responsibility as we navigate those corridors of power ourselves now to say, are we bold enough to say no to certain kinds of money, because we know so it's just also a personal reflection process of how am I being complicit and sort of just reproducing what we know doesn't work.
Yeah, for me, I also agree with what Wami and Ruth have talked about, and everybody else, requiring us to reevaluate ourselves and to stop being fixed on our ways because it's not working, it hasn't worked. And also to take cognizance of the fact that we do not live in static moments and the law is not static. We need to be alive of the changes within our societies, of these moments, these defining moments that we're talking about here, and ride on the moment to build a more progressive agenda, a more progressive agenda that defines the moment. We need to now seize the moment and define the moment. And while doing this, we need to be propelled by voices from the ground, because that is the only way that we are going to root our narratives to fix or to be in line with the lived realities. And I think that is a task that each one of us here has, to define the moment based or propelled by voices from the ground.
I don't think I'm ready to say that we should abandon the law. And I think one day I might be, but I need to have an alternative manifesto of how to go forward without the law, like if we go post-law. But considering that I'm still in the place where I believe we can do something through the law, it's a very unfair system, but we need to do something through it. I want to articulate that it's not just the law, because it's not in vacuum. We need to think about the institutions that produce the law, as you said, but also the institutions that protect the law. And obviously thinking of court systems, but also thinking about parliaments, thinking about what's the relationship between the rise of populism in executives and these judicial institutions. So I think investing in these institutions that can create some sort of an attempt to make equal access to law and legislating new legislations that are representative of the populations, that speak to the realities on the ground. I think this is a fight that we need to be having beyond just fighting for the content of one law at a time. And that is a big challenge, particularly in populist times.
To answer your question, Mark, it doesn't concern me so much that law is both the problem and the solution. I take that for granted. That's the job, I think, that we all signed up for as lawyers. We chose to address social issues through the law. Other people chose to address those same issues through social work or some type of humanities or through the medical profession, whatever. We chose the law, so the job is always going to be coming up with a solution for today that 10 years' time won't work anymore. I once asked one of our deputy national directors of public prosecutions why they didn't write in a proper independence clause into the National Prosecuting Authority in the Constitution, and he was part of drafting it, and his response was, at the time our concern wasn't the independence of the institution, but who would influence who that director would be. That fight has now changed. That's always going to happen. So we always, 10 years, 5 years, 20 years, 100 years, going to look back and say, why on earth did we do that? It makes no sense now. But it was a different fight that was had then. I'm quite comfortable with that. That's the job. As a procedural lawyer, I always ask myself, not how can I fix the world, but how can one set of procedures or one set of legal rules impact in one area, whether it's mitigating harm to complainants in sexual offences, or whether it's challenging the way the state has decided to regulate protests. That's my job as a lawyer, and I'm fine with that. I think that's what we all chose to do.
Before we close, let me ask you one final question, and I'd like all of you to try and answer it in just 1 or 2 sentences, and that is, what do you see from the research you've done through your PhDs over the last few years, now some of you almost finishing your PhDs, and entering this kind of brave new world order that we're in, or maybe not so new world order. What do you see as a space for this project that all of us are engaged in called Law and Society in Africa, or Law and Society in Africa and the Middle East? What do you see as a space for this kind of intellectual endeavor? Is there a space for it? And if so, what kind of space? Another way to ask that question is, what do you see as the key research agendas or key research priorities for those of us coming from many different countries in Africa and the Middle East who care about the interaction between law and society, not just what the law says, but what the law does? What should we be thinking about based on your expertise? I'll start with Ruth, and then we'll just go across.
Okay, for me, it would be how can Africa sustain itself better? Because once we figure out sustainability, I feel there's power in sustainability when you know you can define the agenda in and of yourself, because you can sustain yourself. So whether that's a research project, whether that's an implementation project as a practitioner, how are you self-sustaining yourself? And how can you better sustain the projects we have?
I think for me, the underlying question is, who is Africa working for? When you say Africa, in a lot of conferences you hear expressions like Africa rising and all of that. Who is it rising for? When it has risen, who's going to benefit from its rising? So I think for me that is where the project should go to, and clamors for entrepreneurship and all of that. You can't entrepreneur yourself out of a bad system. You can't entrepreneur yourself out of bad roads without electricity. So when you say Africa is rising and it's working, who is it working for? And I think that's the real job. When you say law and society, it's not law for society or law in society. Law and society. And I think understanding that those two work together and should speak to each other is where the direction of the law or our research going forward should go to.
So as I started out saying, these are not new issues, but that because of that, we can notice warning signs. And so I think our research priorities must be on picking up on those warning signs that we're seeing in our different contexts. So whether it's debates about constitutional law and whether things like constitutions are helpful, rights discourses, which at the moment is under a lot of critique, but basically any kind of discourse that deals with preventing harm, whether that's through individual rights, communal rights, or any other way we want to do that. Inequality and reducing class distinctions or economic oppression, as one said, that's the real cause, and I agree with him about the rise in populism, people feeling vulnerable within their own space and then needing to push back, and the only way you do that is by othering others. So anything that relates to xenophobia or related issues that deals with that. And then I think most importantly, targeting issues that address transparency and accountability, whether that's at an institutional level, a state level, an individual level, because it's only through transparency and accountability that we can push back on the hegemonic power that institutions and states are able to harness in authoritarian states. And if we write those in at the beginning and constantly push for accountability, that's where I say I think all of our work in different ways should be addressing that.
I think I'll start by acknowledging the fact that we are all involved in very diverse areas on how the law impacts on the society, what Shani was talking about, law in the society. And I can't offer a solution to each and every of the different work that each one of us here does. But I think the question that we need to ask ourselves in our respective spaces is, how do we participate in the everyday forms of resistance within our very specialized and our respective spaces? And that's the only way that the law in our different areas will work for the society.
I think building on what Smith says, and similarly, I think everyone has their own way of thinking about the law and their research agendas. But to me, it's also thinking about how to mobilize the law and legal institutions to support and for the interest of struggles on the ground. That's one key thing that I think even though I believe we need to look at big issues, but thinking about the everyday struggles will never stop being a priority, to me at least. But also I think it's really important at this time to think about decolonizing our laws. And I don't mean it in the sense of traditional versus Western, do we have Anglo-Saxon laws, and this is not the way I mean it, but I think delinking it from colonial powers, from imperial interests, from particularly economic interests that are basically answering to your point of who is Africa rising for? Just making sure that when the law makes Africa rise, it's for all of us and not for someone else. Thank you.
Okay, let me take the last 30 seconds and just try and summarize some of the things that I heard in this last question. For all of us who are thinking about this relationship, this is not a conference in law, this is a conference in law and society. And we have 5 different provocations coming to us, which evidences for us the real interdisciplinarity of the law and society field. We have Ruth thinking about, if you care about law and society, the question you should be asking is, how can you sustain yourself? We have Wami asking a different kind of question, but the broader question of how or what is Africa or the Middle East working for? If Africa or the Middle East are rising, who are they rising for? Who benefits? Who doesn't benefit? And how to think about pessimism in that process. We have Jamila offering a different piece of advice around what are the warning signs? If you are a lawyer who thinks about the law in an interdisciplinary way, how do you pick up on the warning signs in different contexts? And for her, the important warning signs are transparency, or the lack of transparency, accountability, the lack of accountability. What are the warning signs that you see in your particular context? These are the things that Jamila might encourage you to write about in your own research agenda. We have Smith saying, once again, how do we think about the most vulnerable people in a society, everyday forms of resistance, and how can we, as law and society scholars, participate in that project through our writing, through our research, through our teaching? And finally, we have Heba saying, how can we, if we are to pursue a research agenda for law and society, How can we decolonize this research agenda, which has primarily come from places in North America, from places in Europe, places with power? How can we reclaim those sources of power to decolonize both colonial and post-colonial forms of power? This is a broad set of questions. These aren't the only questions. If we had 5 different people on the panel, this panel would have looked very different. So these are 5 perspectives. I hope that during the lunch and during the breaks we have, and during the other sessions, people pick up on these themes of warning signs and power and how to explain what's rising and what isn't rising, and sustainability and everyday resistance. So please thank me in joining our 5 panelists, and I look forward to the rest of the session.